This is a this is a topic. I know there's many Americans that seem to be befuddled or confused with the Electoral College. What is it? It's not really a college to start with. The term Electoral College came out in 1845. A journalist brought that terminology up. But they were always known as the electors when the country was founded. The question always comes, why don't we have direct popular vote? And if you've been following the news over the past few years, there's been this attempt to get rid of the Electoral College. Some of that is Democrats because they didn't like the way the elections turned out in 2000 and 2016. And yet, when you think about it, it's Democrats, Republicans who choose the electors anyway, in a process that was put together before political parties. That's part of the problem here. Your founders, at the risk of sounding impertinent, didn't trust you. Some of your founders didn't trust you. They didn't think the common man could run a country. Your founders were dead set against popular democracy. They didn't trust the common man. They didn't think the common man could keep up on what was necessary to be the sole leader of the country through the popular vote. And so interesting when the country is, at the Constitutional Convention, and when, in fact, I have it right here. Interesting here what James Madison writes in Federalist 51. He says, "But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary." What that line? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. How is that going to work if it's supposed to control itself? Do you think people can honestly control themselves? Now, that's a question for you. A dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on the government. But experience has taught us, mankind, the necessity of auxiliary precautions. Keep in mind when your founders in 1787 met in Philadelphia to try to put some sort of government together, they were working with 13 separate entities. We call them colonies, which are soon to become states after 1787. Keep in mind, when you had your Declaration of Independence, which, by the way, the real name for that document is the Unanimous Declaration of the 13 United States of America. That's the name, that's the real name of that document. But that's 1776. We're not even a country yet, and some of your founders are calling us the United States of America. That's chutzpah. But you're talking about arranging 13 colonies, 13 independent colonies, 13 autonomous entities. Think about it for a moment. You have 13 people in 13 colonies who are autonomous. They're semi-independent. They have their own traditions, own social mores, their own economies, and their own way of doing business, their own way of electing their local officials. What does somebody in South Carolina have to do with somebody in Massachusetts? That's the state of the cupboard. That's the state of the cupboard in 1776. However, as they are getting tired of monarchical rule, George III of England, they're getting tired of this. Thomas Jefferson listed the grievances in that Declaration of Independence. They are able to get on July 4, 1776, 56 signers from 13 colonies. That's one of the real essences here of the Declaration of Independence. It was a unifier. You can't have uprisings in 13 colonies and expect to win a revolution. That's not how it works. You need to have some sort of unifier. that document was. People came together with one objective: to throw out the overseer, to throw out the oppressor, to throw out the British crown. What happens afterwards is going to be a different story. Okay, so in 1787, by that time, the crown is gone. They now sit down in Philadelphia. They now have to overcome their differences to put together a country. And they are going to come together over the months, the summer months into the fall of 1787, and they're going to hammer out something they call a republic. Understand something here. If you go back and read your founders, and I urge you to do so, when you read the founders, what they're writing, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Adams, so on and so forth, these people aren't just teaching you history or political science. It's an English class. You ever read some of the emails you get today? What happened to the English language? Go back to that era. And keep in mind, when they went to school, they were trained in Grecian classics, Latin classics, English classics. They were taught music, science, rhetoric. They had a well-rounded education. Some of these people were in college by the time they were 14. Of course, it's a different world then, I'll give you that. But they are going to hammer out something here. They are going to consult why the Greek democracy did not last long. They are going to look back at the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, the Senate. They are going to look at what some of the writers of the Age of Reason Enlightenment are writing here. Edmund Burke, Henry St. John Bolingbroke, Thomas Hobbes, Voltaire, Montesquieu. And they are going to consult all of what's written here, all of history prior, to put together this thing they call the American Republic. Now, they want this to last, and they are going to put together a system, and I know you were told this in school, a system of checks and balances. Well, what are those checks and balances? If you read people like Burke and you read people like Montesquieu, Montesquieu was one that thought you needed a balanced government. You needed a system of, you can't have a dictator or a monarch, because that's not going to work. You have a balanced government, perhaps a judiciary, perhaps an elected leader. We're going to call him a president. How about a legislative branch? And I believe it was Burke who thought they all should be equal. They all should be equal, but at the same time, he thought the legislative branch should be a bit more equal. If you really think about the kind of government you're supposed to have, which you don't have now, but one you're supposed to have, your Congress should be your firewall. That should be your firewall, especially the House of Representatives. Don't you elect that person every 2 years? Of course you do. Of course, when your founders are framing this, they don't want to leave the common man out. They know they can't. But at the same time, it's Alexander Hamilton who states, all societies divide themselves into two basic classes. First, there is the rich and the well-born, and then the mass. The masses are too tempestuous and too unpredictable to rule. Leave, therefore, to the first class a permanent stake in rule, as they will forever steady the masses. Now, I'm sure there's some people sitting here listening to this that won't quite agree with that. But they didn't trust the common man, but you can't leave the common man out. So how are they going to fashion this? First, they're going to come up with a judiciary, which is capped by the Supreme Court. You never did. You didn't from the beginning, and you never have. You don't elect those people. They are appointed for you by the people you do elect. The legislative branch. At one point in discussions, there was only one house in the legislative branch. And yet some sober thinkers in Philadelphia are saying, well, how can you have the judiciary? How can you have a leader, which they're eventually going to decide to call him a president, but only one house in the legislative branch? Supposing a strong-willed individual takes control of that legislative branch, and there's no check on his power. Now what do you have? A competition between the overseer of the legislative, the only house in the legislative branch, and the president? No. We need a second house to check the first house in the legislative branch. So you're going to have two houses really in the legislative branch, the Senate and the House of Representatives. Keep in mind from the very beginning, you as a voter could vote for your representative in the House of Representatives. In the beginning of the country, when the country started, your senators, your 6-year senators, you did not vote for them. They were applied for you by your state legislators. This was something that was considered a sop to states' rights. Remember the term? Remember what the Southerners used to say? They were the big defenders of states' rights, 1859, 1860, 1861. That's a lot of bunk. They weren't. But they considered states' rights a cornerstone of the Confederacy. Well, go back to the founding of the country. If you allow the people who vote for their state representatives in their states and allow their state representatives to choose the senators to represent that state, then that is a booster for states' rights. The people vote for their state reps. The state reps, in turn, in their capitals, will apply the senators. That's the system the country started with. That will change in 1913 when an amendment will be applied to the Constitution, giving you the right to choose or elect your 6-year senator. But from 1787 to 1913, well, actually, it was 1789, once the states, ratified the Constitution. From 1789 to 1913, you didn't vote for your senators. Your state legislators applied them for you. But that was changed in 1913. But the ability to vote for your representative has been part of the original American Republic from the start. And so, but what about the president? Sure, people can vote for the president. Now, keep in mind, this is where it gets a little, this is where it can, for some, I know for some it gets a little difficult here. The states, not every state is the same size. Not every state has the same amount of people. And so you're going to have small states, you're going to have large states. And the fear here was that, yes, the large states will actually wield the power over the small states. So when it came to running for president, the fear here by some is the big states will bully the small states. Now, keep in mind, before I go any farther here, you are talking about a country, meaning the United States. It only has 13 states, and it's only got about 3.5, 4 million people. That's it. You are talking about a country where at the very beginning, there were no political parties. There were no conventions. There was no campaigns. The prevailing mood here is, and this goes back to people like, from England, political theorist Henry St. John Bolingbroke, who stated that political parties were evil. Political parties are evil. They are satraps for chicanery. So you have a country where you don't have parties. In fact, the theory here is a man did not go after office. The office sought the man. Now, the first president, who was the first president? George Washington. Keep in mind, George Washington didn't want to be president. He wanted to go home. No, he wants you to stick around for a while. So he stuck around to be president. He's the first president. I want to go home. No, stick around. So he stuck around for a second term. Keep in mind, it is because of what Franklin D. Roosevelt, him getting elected a fourth term, that Congress got together and passed legislation. You cannot be president more than 2 terms. Yet, from George Washington out until 1933, he set the stage. He set the pattern. It was voluntary. After 2 terms, up to 1933, nobody ran for a 3rd term anymore. George Washington set the pace. They didn't need a law. That's what kind of a country you had. That's the kind of country you had. George Washington himself, if you've ever read his farewell address, which I urge you to read, it's one of the best ever penned. He warned against parties. He said, parties he said parties can be bad because in parties, people will eventually, you will get a lot of people who eventually opt to support the precepts of the party as opposed to the precepts of the country, and they will sell their country down the river. Interesting assessment in 1796. Look at your country today. You don't think that doesn't exist? Interesting, what George Washington warned about. But at the same time, yes, you can vote for your president, but we need to have a check on the people. We don't trust the common man. The common man usually is not up on things. And so how are they going to check this? A system they call electors. And it's written into your Constitution. The executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States. He shall hold his term of office for 4 years and together with the vice president chosen for the same term be elected as follows. This is in Article 2, Section 1 of your Constitution. Each state shall appoint, in such manner as the legislation thereof may direct, a number of electors. Again, here we are with states' rights. The Constitution, which these 13 colonies are going to ratify, become 13 states. They have to have the electors, but how each state picks the electors, it's up to them. States' rights again. Each state shall appoint in such manner as the state legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in Congress, but no senator and no state representative or person holding office or trust or profit under the United States shall be appointed as an elector. That means a sitting senator and a sitting representative cannot be an elector. You cannot be an elected official. You can be a state elected official, but you can't be a federal elected official. Out of bounds. Having said that, again, even with 13 states, not every state is the same size. So how are they going to determine this? Simple. They call it the electoral vote count. Each state has 2 senators no matter the size. Again, look at us in California. Little Connecticut with 3.5 million people has 2 senators. California, which has approximately 40 million people, has 2 senators. Connecticut today has 5 representatives to Congress. We have 5 representative districts. Altogether, that gives us 7 electoral votes. California, well, California has 53 representative districts. They have 55 electoral votes. Now, you're probably thinking, well, how fair is that? It is fair. The way your founders have this laid out in the beginning here, it's fascinating. The electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for 2 persons. Now, your founders are trying to think of everything here. They know that you had 13 independent colonies. Now you have 13 so-called independent states, but in a union. And so when these electors go to vote, and people are people here, you know that. If they're going to vote, are they going to vote for somebody from the locale, perhaps, from their state? How can you have 13 electors? How can you have electors from 13 states voting for a favorite son in each state? What kind of an election is that? So each can vote for 2 persons. Only one of the 2 persons the electors can agree on can come from their state. The other person has to come from outside their state. They're trying to think of how to stop regionalism, is what they're trying to do here, of whom at least one can be an inhabitant of the state. And they shall make a list of all people voted for. All these people they are going to vote for you're going to decide on who they want, and then they have to send it to the president of the Senate. Now, keep in mind the way this is going to work. Whoever runs for the presidency, you can have 5 or 6 people running for the presidency. Whoever gets the most electoral votes is the president. Whoever gets the second highest total will be vice president. Again, there are no parties here. And even when parties come in, interesting, in 1796, in the 1796 election, John Adams is the next president after George Washington. He was a Federalist. Thomas Jefferson got the second most votes. He was a Democrat Republican. So for the third term of office here for a president, John Adams is your second president, but he's actually fulfills the third term. John Adams was a Federalist. He came from the Federalist Party. Thomas Jefferson was a Democrat Republican. Your vice president is not from the same party. Now, would that work today? That would be an issue today, wouldn't it? However, Adams and Jefferson got along fairly well. And even though he was a Federalist, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams didn't really care too much for Alexander Hamilton, and neither did Jefferson. They were political rivals. In fact, I mentioned this earlier when I was talking to Carrie. At one point, John Adams called Alexander Hamilton a bastard product of a Scotch peddler. That's what he called him. So it's interesting how some of your founders thought about each other here. But at the same time, Harry Smith, a representative from South Carolina, was looking at the future. He brought legislation to the floor that perhaps in a future election, maybe somebody who wins the presidency, whoever has the second most votes as vice president, comes from a different party, will not want to serve with the president from a different party. Okay, so why don't we have people vote for two candidates? Now we're getting to this thing with slates like you do today. You know, when you voted in 2016, you didn't vote just for Hillary Clinton. You were voting for Tom Kean, too, as vice president. Or if you voted for Trump, you voted for Mike Pence as vice president. It's a slate. And that was shot down. However, in the 1800 election, Thomas Jefferson is now running again for president. And there's a tie here. And this is where the Electoral College comes in. There's a tie. And so it's Thomas Jefferson against Aaron Burr. Both had 71 electoral votes. Interesting what transpires here. It gets thrown back into the House of Representatives. That's how this is supposed to work. If nobody has the amount of electoral votes, it's supposed to get thrown back into the House of Representatives because the House of Representatives is considered the people's house. Now, your first question is going to be, well, there's different sizes of states. Some states have more people than others. Some states have more representative districts than others. They'll have more electoral votes. And you're right. But having said that, in 1800, it didn't make any difference the size, the state, how many people the state had, how many electoral votes it had. Each state, no matter if it's Connecticut or California, in a situation like that, gets one vote. Connecticut, with 7 electoral votes, our representatives representing us in this endeavor get one vote. California, with 53 electoral votes, gets one vote. So now all these people who represent these districts in each state have to come together to vote for one candidate when it's thrown back into the House. And that could be a problem. To be perfectly honest with you, that can be a problem. And it was in 1800. Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, interestingly enough, even though they were tied with 71 electoral votes each, they were from the same party. They were Democrat Republican. However, Alexander Hamilton is interesting here from the perspective that he was running around the House telling people you don't want to vote for Aaron Burr, you want to vote for Thomas Jefferson. And they are going to go through 36 roll call votes. Imagine that, 36 roll call votes until Thomas Jefferson won the election in the House. He will be president for 2 terms, but he won the election after 36 roll call votes. And then in 1804, you will see the 13th Amendment passed, and the 12th Amendment. And so now they are going to vote for slates because the idea here is, again, this idea comes up, maybe the loser even if he's from the same party, is not going to want to play second fiddle to the victor. So now you're going to vote for slates. And in this attempt to vote for slates, again, if someone does not have the amount of electoral votes necessary to win, then each of these electors will choose the top 3 vote getters, and then once they decide who they are, they will be sent back to the House. And each state delegation will have 1 vote in determining who is going to be the victor. Only this time you are going to see, after 1804, now you're going to see voting for slates. And if there's a tie between electors for vice president, that tie gets broken in the Senate. And so it's interesting what your founders are trying to put together here to act as a check on the common man. Now, at one point here, during the French Revolution, you get to 1792, 1793, when the terror starts. And a lot of people are going to the guillotine. There were some members of your founding generation who thought, well, maybe we ought to get rid of the electors. And they changed their mind because they saw what happened to democracy in France. You can't trust the common man. Blood flowed in the streets. We can't have that here. They will keep the electors. Now, as you go through your history, it's interesting some of what happens in some of these elections here. And I'm going to bring up one election here, which I thought was interesting. 1824. In 1824, well, you probably know Andy Jackson was president from 1828 to 1836. He served 2 terms. He actually ran for president in 1824. And interesting, there were 4 candidates who did not have enough electoral votes. They were Andy Jackson, John Quincy Adams, John Adams' son, William Crawford, and Henry Clay. Well, Andy Jackson, you needed 131 electoral votes. Andy Jackson had 99, John Quincy Adams 84. Crawford's going to bail out, and so is Henry Clay. And so now it goes back to the House of Representatives. And now the House, again, each state delegation gets 1 vote. And in this debate, these debates that went on in the House, Andy Jackson will not win the presidency. It'll be John Quincy Adams. Interesting here. And again, this gets back to what is considered a weakness of the Electoral College. Andy Jackson, though he lost, had 151,271 votes. And John Adams had 113,122. And he won the election because it was decided in the House. Interesting. Another one, 1876. And then I'm going to move on here. 1876. This is one of the hardest fought elections in the history of this country. It was Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican from Ohio, against Samuel J. Tilden from the state of New York. And when the popular vote is being counted, it comes up that 3 states are in question here. They are Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. Note the states: Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. The year is 1876. Where are those states? The South. They were ex-Confederate states. That's important here. And so Samuel J. Tilden, you needed 185 electoral votes to be president in 1876. He has 184. He needs 1 more vote. Rutherford B. Hayes, 165. In each of these states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, both Democrats and Republicans said that our candidate won. You can't have an election like this. That should have been thrown back into the House of Representatives. It will not be. It will not be thrown back into the House. Southern politicians and Northern politicians are going to get together. And the Southern Democrats are going to tell these Northern Republicans, if you want the White House, fine. but you get Northern troops out of the South. That will be the end of Reconstruction. It's called the Compromise of 1876, and Northern troops will be out of the South, and that's the end of Reconstruction in 1877. And what do you think happened to the promise to the blacks? What do you think? Jim Crow laws, the Ku Klux Klan. Yeah, that's where this is going to go. Now, interesting here, too, that even though Rutherford B. Hayes won the election, he got 185 electoral votes. He beat Tilden, who had one less, 184. Yet, Rutherford B. Hayes had 4,034,311 popular votes in 21 states. Tilden had 4,288,546 popular votes in 17 states. Again, here you see another example where a man who had the most votes did not get elected because they didn't get the electoral vote count in the beginning. Of course, again, maybe Tilden would have won if the election was thrown back into the House like it's stated in the 12th Amendment. It doesn't happen this way. It doesn't happen this way. Now, today, after Democrats and Republicans, the 2000 election, I'm sure some of you remember that one, Al Gore against George Bush Jr. And Al Gore, there was a question as to the voting in Florida. And if you remember, in Florida, the Supreme Court will step in. Now, there was a lot of chicanery going on here with the voting. Many blacks weren't counted. Some of these were guys in uniform who, by the way, might have been overseas. And so they supposedly checked to see if they were home. And since they were not home, they didn't check on them. Yet guys in the uniform were voting. I know my son did when he was in Iraq. He got to vote. Absentee ballots. They give them to you, you can vote. However, the Supreme Court stepped in, and they were counting the votes, repeated counting of the votes, and the Supreme Court will step in and give the election to George Bush Jr. However, interesting, Bush got his 271 electoral votes, and Gore had 266. He lost by 5. Yet, George Bush had 50,456,000 votes, and Al Gore 50,999,000 votes. It was that close. When you're fast forward to 2016, Hillary Clinton beat George Bush by approximately 2.9 to 3 million popular votes. Yet, she lost in the electoral vote count. Of course, she lost 3 states she supposedly was going to win: Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Supposedly the Democrats thought they had those 3 states. She would have won. She didn't. When you get back to these anomalies here, let's understand something about our voting in this country since the founding of the country. Most elections are decided by the popular vote. You don't get your electoral votes until you get them in each state. That's true. However, most of the elections in this country have been decided by the popular vote, not the Electoral College. Most all the elections have been decided by the popular vote. However, again, that system is in place. The Electoral College is in place because many of the founders did not trust you. Now that leads to a question. Do you feel like you've been slighted here? Maybe you do. But the question here is, when you go back to 2000, when you look at how Gore lost the election, and then Democrats have the chutzpah to turn around and blame Ralph Nader, since he got 2.5% of the vote as a third-party candidate. And so they're going to blame him for Gore's loss. If Gore was that good of a candidate, he would have won, whether Bush or Nader. Same thing with Hillary Clinton. If she was that good of a candidate, she would have beat Trump straight up. Apparently, people didn't think she was as good. And same thing with Gore. Same thing with Gore. So Democrats ought to put up or shut up, put up a good candidate and run them. That's the problem here. It's not so much the system as it is the candidates themselves. Now understand who picks the electors today. Alexander Hamilton, and I mentioned this before, thought that maybe the voters should pick the electors. How about the voters? He writes this in Federalist number 63. Maybe the voters should pick the electors. That's not how the system works today. Democrats and Republicans pick the electors. And so when you're voting, either back in 2016, when you voted for Hillary and Tom Kaine, or you voted for Trump and Mike Pence, you are not only voting for, as a Democrat or Republican, you are not only voting for the president and vice president, you are also voting for your electors. Their names will appear on those ballots. Interesting how it works in the state. Usually the party picks these at the party convention or perhaps at the central committee meeting. They will pick the electors. And those electors are going to be on the ballot. They're not going to be on the elected ballot. You're not going to see them. But I'm talking about the certificate of ascertainment that the governor has to sign off on and send to the president of the Senate in Washington, D.C. That certificate of ascertainment has the president and vice presidential candidates from the parties and also the names of the electors. You can petition your party to know who your electors are. You can do that. It's not like you can't. You can. But when you vote, you're not, in this state, you're not just voting for 2 people for the White House. You're also voting for 7 others, the electors. That's what you're voting for. So it's interesting how you're voting not for 2 people, but for 9. Now, the electors themselves will meet in each state. That was another thing that the founders wanted. They did not want the electors from all the states meeting in one place. They thought chicanery could be going on here. So the electors will meet in each state in 50 states now. And they will meet on the first Wednesday, the second Wednesday after the first Wednesday after the second Monday of each month in December. And they will cast their votes, both Democrats and Republicans. And they will fill out certificates of vote, which in turn are going to be sent to the president of the Senate. And in January, they're going to open all these up and they're going to count these votes. And keep in mind, the popular vote should have been counted by now. But that's basically how your system works. And one of the major reasons the system doesn't work now is because Democrats and Republicans pick the electors. And now a bunch of Democrats now don't like the way the system is working, yet they help pick the electors here. Now, understand something here, too. When your founders were looking to put together the ability to vote, they thought in the beginning, very beginning, well, maybe Congress should choose the president. They decided against this. And the reason they did, they thought this would lead to hard feelings among those senators and representatives in Congress. There was another reason they turned it down. They did not want undue influence from overseas upsetting your senators and your representatives to maybe try to get somebody in as the president. So they canceled that out. The next model. Okay, how about the state representatives voting for president? Because people in their states vote for their state representatives. And so when you vote for your state representative every 4 years, your representatives in your state would vote for president. The founders decided against that one. And the reason they decided against that is that they thought, depending on the size of the state, big states would have presidents more often than small states. And big states could collude, like maybe Virginia and New York, at the expense of the small states. No. And on top of that, they also thought that if the state legislators pick the president, that the president would be partial to certain states over other states. Okay, no, we don't want that. Then they went to the system which we just talked about. However, today, I always put, with what's going on today in 2020, I always put the Electoral College in the same boat as the post office and taking the census. They all share one thing in common. They are all in the Constitution. You will find them in the Constitution. Every 10 years, we're supposed to have a census here. The postal system, Congress is supposed to make sure we have a viable postal system. And voting. Keep in mind the way the country has grown. The Electoral College is a unifier. And it's a unifier. Look at some of the elections. When John F. Kennedy was running in 1960 against Nixon, who did he pick as his running mate? Lyndon B. Johnson from Texas? Why did he pick Johnson? To bring the electoral votes from those southern states so they could made up with a guy from Massachusetts. What did Joe Biden just do? Who did he pick as his running mate? Kamala Harris. Where is she from? California. That's 53 electoral votes. And so West Coast is unified to the East Coast. Now, this really worked fairly well when you had a bona fide two-party system. And some of you, I'm sure, are old enough, were children in World War II. And you remember the giant community scene that existed in this country. Everyone came together to preserve the country against the threat posed by Nazism, Japanese militarism, and fascism. And I'm someone who was born in the 1950s, so I vaguely remember those people who fought or worked in the factories of World War II built this country in the 1950s. I am a beneficiary of that. And I remember the community scene that existed. And so many of your people immediately after the war, even into the 1950s, 60s, 70s, even the 1980s, some of these people, Democrats and Republicans, come out of that community scene. And sure, they had their political differences, but they would eventually reach something known as compromise. You had a bona fide two-party system that worked. And it worked because, go back to the 50s, and I vaguely remember these people, the John Birchers. You know, you had real arch conservatives, real liberals, like communists. They weren't going to get anywhere. Why? Because the majority of the American public was going to vote Democrat or Republican. And so you would get people from the extreme right or the extreme left becoming Republicans or Democrats. They are now with the mainstream. And it's almost like Democrats and Republicans were the political antibodies for the political body of this country. That no longer works. Let me ask you a question. How many people from World War II are still in Congress? Nothing. They're not, nobody. It's the baby boomer generation that took over. You do not have Democrats and Republicans who act as that proper filter. Go back to your elections in November of 2016. Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, who were anti-establishment candidates. That's where you are. And that's one of the reasons your electoral system really doesn't work as well anymore. And so when you take a look at the Electoral College, don't just look at the Electoral College system, look at the entire voting process itself. Personally, I remember I got picked by the League of Women Voters and that National Popular Vote Interstate Compact people. These are people who want to maybe not get rid of the Electoral College, but have the popular vote be the way to elect people to office, and the electoral votes applied thereafter. And I got picked to be on a panel, and there was a Hendrik Hertzberg from New Yorker magazine. He was a nationally syndicated columnist. Pamela Norman, who was a big noise with Common Cause Massachusetts. They were for that National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, where if enough states opt on to this, once you hit 270 electoral votes, we just go with their system. That's what they were presenting. I was on the panel, and another man from Connecticut was on the panel. His name is Luther Weeks. And I would urge you to have your library bring Luther in to give a talk or Zoom a talk. Luther is a retired software engineer. He audits elections. That's what Luther does. And there's nobody I know that knows the rules and regulations of voting in this state like Luther Weeks. He's a nice guy, soft-spoken, explains everything very well, and he knows his stuff. He was against getting rid of the Electoral College. And in these two forums that we had, one was at the Westport Playhouse, another at the Greenwich Library, and there were 180 to 200 people at each setting. Luther explained, he says, I hope you folks understand that we have 50 states in this country. Each state has different rules and regulations for voting. And he says, I hope you also understand that deep into December, they were still counting votes in California. And that most elections in this country are won by the popular vote, to which Luther's correct. Myself, whether we keep the Electoral College or not, I don't believe in just using the math to get around it. And that system is voluntary according to the practitioners of the popular vote compact here. Once we hit 270, 271, we're on the system. Yet they say it's voluntary. So my question was, well, supposing Maine wants to get out, and they got 4 electoral votes, and let's say they leave that compact, and now you're down to 267 electoral votes, worth of states. Now we're back to the old system. Where's the continuity here? Myself, if we're going to get rid of the Electoral College, we need to go through the Constitution. That is rule of law, constitutional law. It says in Article 1, Section 10, that interstate compacts are illegal unless okayed by Congress. I mean, it's in black and white. That's not hard to figure out. At the same time, if you want to get rid of the Electoral College, we do it the same way black men got the right to vote, women got the right to vote. Propose legislation. If it passes both chambers of the legislative branch, it now becomes legislation that has to be okayed or ratified by the states. According to the Constitution, Article 5, this has to be where 3/4 of the states, now we have 50 states, now it's got to be 38 states ratify it before it becomes applied to an amendment to the Constitution. That is rule of law. This is how that's how this situation should be handled. But apparently maybe not enough people want to do that. Maybe not enough people want to do that because your Constitution is your blueprint for government. Your Bill of Rights are your protections against the infringement of government. That's how the country was formed, and that's how the country should live. That's how it should work. But I know there's probably some people who still have questions on this particular topic. So if you would like to ask questions, you're more than welcome to go ahead. I agree. You're the founders of this country. The founders of this country, and this is how I classify the founders. They were enlightened authoritarians. To me, that's what they were. Now, you mentioned Rome, and that's a great example because when Rome had the Republic, I mean the real Roman Republic, they had their voting developed into what they called centuries. It depended in Rome on income. You were put into blocks of 100. And so when the Roman Senate passed something, I don't know, maybe they want to expand the army. And the people of Rome are going to vote. And they're voting in blocks of 100. Yet each block of 100 gets, guess what? One vote to either be in favor of what the Senate's proposing or be in disfavor of what the Senate's proposing, and then you add the votes. Now, interestingly enough, take a look at how your founders saw this, coming up with what we call the Electoral College. Each state delegation gets one vote, no matter how many senators and representatives it has in Congress. You see what they're looking at here? Now, before I end that, there are even some, and I don't quite agree with this. Some even said that the Electoral College could be considered patterned after the College of Cardinals in Rome. Now, there's about, 150 cardinals? I think it's about 150 that determine who the next pope is going to be. My problem with that is, are the hundreds of millions of Catholics casting ballots at their local churches for the next pope? No, they're not. Who chooses the pope? College of Cardinals. So I don't quite go with that example. But the one from Rome, because yes, the founders of this country did research Rome. And they also saw what happened. In fact, I'm reading a book now on the fall of the Roman Republic. And it's interesting how the oligarchs took over. Rome became a war state. They put a lot of their resources toward the army. What do you think's happening here? And just to add to that, it's interesting, your question, Ben Franklin comes to mind here. And in 1787, at the Constitutional Convention, he was asked, well, what do you think? And Ben Franklin was really probably the elder statesman here at this point. He says, well, I agree to this Constitution with all its faults. And I believe we need a government. I also believe that this government should be well administered. And I believe it will be well administered over a course of years. And it will only end up in despotism as the people will become so corrupted as to be capable of nothing else but despotism. That was Ben Franklin. The question is very interesting here about consulting Greece and consulting Rome. And they also consulted Thomas Hobbes, his book Leviathan. They consulted a lot here. The founders of this country were steeped in understanding history, steeped in it. So interesting. Great question. Great question.
But if there is no questions, I also, since you were bringing up the women's right to vote, I wanted to mention that our library is going to be having a program on September 30th. The Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame is going to do a presentation on the anniversary of the women's right to vote. So more information will be coming out about that, but I hope you will be able to join us.
Yeah, I've been giving talks on the 100th anniversary of the woman's right to vote. And I've been giving talks on the suffrage movement itself, the 19th Amendment. And I've been giving talks on Susan B. Anthony. I'm giving a talk tomorrow, and it's one of my favorites, for the Oliver Wolcott Library at 1 o'clock. It's a Zoom talk on Helen Keller, but as a socialist. She was an ardent socialist. She was anti-capitalist, pro-worker. She was also an ardent supporter of a woman's right to vote. She also supported Lenin's revolution in 1917, and she wrote quite fluently on socialism, beginning like in 1912, 1913, out to about 1922, 1923. I have some of her writings as a socialist archive. They're interesting to read. But she was a social, and when you read things about her or listen to people talk about her, they don't seem to mention that too much at all. Her story is remarkable, overcoming blindness and deafness. I'll give you that. She was a remarkable individual, but she was also a socialist, anti-capitalist, pro-worker. Interesting individual.
It looks like we don't have any questions. So I know things are a little bit different when it's online or WebEx instead of in person.
Right.
But thank you very much for joining us tonight, Mark. And hopefully next time we have you present, it will be in person and things will be better.
Let's hope.
Yes. Right. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for tuning in. Have yourselves a great evening.